So let's talk about James Rachel's and his take on active and passive euthanasia. In the article, James Rachel's discusses a scenario. In the story, we have two men who stand to gain financially if his cousin is no longer around. Okay, his cousin's a child, but if the child dies, then the man gets money. Now, Smith, wanting that money, goes in to the bathroom while the child is bathing. And he goes over, he grabs the child and pushes him under the water, and the child drowns. Smith has killed his cousin. Jones also stands to gain if his cousin dies, wants that money, goes into the bathroom with the intent to kill his cousin, but right as he comes in, he sees the child slip, hit his head, fall under the water, and drown. Jones does not physically kill his cousin. Jones stands by and lets the cousin die. The corollary here is that active euthanasia is killing. We often say active euthanasia is killing, but passive euthanasia is letting die. Okay? If I administer the medication myself, I'm killing the patient. But if I simply withdraw treatment, I'm letting nature take its course and I'm letting the patient die. If a miracle happens and the patient lives, yay, awesome. But more likely, nature's going to take its course and the patient will die, and I'm allowing it to happen. Rachel says, in the case of Smith and Jones, we are going to hold them equally morally responsible. Okay? We are going to hold Jones as responsible for his cousin's death as we are Smith. Yes, Jones let the boy die, but he did just that. He stood by and let the boy die. Smith intervened. Smith killed the cousin, but both cousins died. Both men could have prevented it, and neither did. Smith could have prevented it by not killing him, and Jones could have prevented it by saving the boy, pulling him out of the water. Rachel's believes that we're going to hold Smith and Jones equally morally responsible, regardless of the fact that Jones merely let his cousin die instead of killing him. Well, making the corollary to euthanasia, the doctor that withholds treatment, Rachel says, is the same as the doctor that administers a medicine that kills the patient. Rachel believes that in both cases, the doctor is equally morally responsible. But he doesn't say this to show that the doctor should not withhold treatment. He actually, there it is, sorry. He actually believes there's no morally relevant difference between killing and letting die. Okay? There is no morally relevant difference between killing and letting die. In fact, it seems more merciful to kill the patient than allowing the patient to wither away in agony. Okay? So we hold the doctor, or rather we would hold somebody equally morally responsible. The doctor is the same way. The doctor withholds treatment is the same as the doctor who administers the medicine and kills the patient. So allowing one and not the other, condemning one and not the other, is silly, Rachel says, because there's no morally relevant difference. There's no morally relevant difference between Smith and Jones he says, Smith who kills his cousin, Jones who allows his cousin to die. There's no morally relevant difference between Smith and Jones. Likewise, there's no morally relevant difference between the doctor that commits an act of passive euthanasia versus active euthanasia. Consider Terri Schiavo. Terri Schiavo, the person was gone. The human being continued, but the human being had a functioning brainstem that kept her heart pumping, her lungs working, the whole 9 yards. The only way to end Terri Schiavo's life within the moral and legal permissibility at the time was to remove her feeding tube. It took her 13 days to die. She died of dehydration and malnutrition. She didn't die because the respirator was removed and her lungs stopped functioning. Her body shut down because of dehydration and malnutrition. Now, the person was gone. The level of awareness of the fact that she was starving and dehydrated was not there. There wasn't a level of awareness. Her consciousness was not there. But nonetheless, it seems more humane to simply administer medication that brings about the ending of her life. We would not, Rachel's would say, allow an animal to do that. We wouldn't just stand by and watch the animal wither away from dehydration and malnutrition. We would euthanize the animal. We should do the same thing, Rachel says, in the case where the patient is suffering. To require them to continue to live several days and possibly in pain and agony seems cruel, where there's no morally relevant difference between active and passive euthanasia. So if you're going to commit an act of passive euthanasia and withhold treatment, go ahead and commit an act of active euthanasia and allow the patient's suffering to end. Does that make sense? Let's look at the argument, okay? Our author offers up the argument. Passive euthanasia is morally permissible. This is true. If passive euthanasia is morally equivalent to active euthanasia is also morally permissible. Passive euthanasia is morally equivalent to active euthanasia. Therefore, active, and we will specify voluntary, euthanasia is morally permissible. Okay, look at premises 2 and 3. Well, look at 2 through 4. Okay, that's an argument form that you've seen before. Okay, reach back into your logic lecture and think it. You can say it out loud. Nobody's around to hear you. Maybe. Well, there shouldn't be. You should be listening to this lecture in a quiet, undisturbed location. What kind of argument is that? If you said modus ponens, you are correct. It is indeed a modus ponens argument. I can't get my thing to work. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Now, we add premise 1 because we need it stated that passive euthanasia is morally permissible. We could have, I suppose, combined it. We could have turned premise 2 into if passive euthanasia is morally equivalent to active euthanasia and passive euthanasia is morally permissible, active euthanasia is also morally permissible. Premise 3 then would have had to have been passive euthanasia is morally equivalent to active euthanasia and passive euthanasia is morally permissible. So we'd have to add it twice. By just saying it once, we've said it. We have it out there. That's what we need. Okay? So this is Rachel's argument. We grant that passive euthanasia is morally permissible. Well, if the two of them are morally equivalent, there's simply no reason to ban active euthanasia. And Rachel says passive and active are morally equivalent. So active euthanasia is morally permissible as well. Does that make sense? Now, if we were evaluating this argument, okay, if we were going to say this is a good argument or a bad argument, we would have to prove one of the premises false. This is a valid argument, okay? So we would have to prove one of the premises false, and the premise to prove false is 3. Because if passive euthanasia is morally equivalent to active euthanasia, and passive euthanasia is morally permissible, then active euthanasia is also morally permissible. There's no reason to ban active and not passive if the two are morally equivalent. So premise 1 is true. You're hard pressed to find somebody who says premise 1 is not true. Premise 2 is true. That's a descriptive statement. Look around. Okay? So if you want to prove that this argument is a bad one, you have to attack premise number 3. Passive euthanasia is morally equivalent to active euthanasia. That's the premise that you would have to prove false to prove that the argument fails. Rachel says the premise is true. And you've seen why. Because of Smith and Jones and their equal moral culpability. Make sense? So let's look at reasoning against euthanasia. Okay, and again, when we say euthanasia, we're really generally talking about active euthanasia. Gay Williams offers up 3 arguments. We're not going to see them in argument form. The first has to do with nature. The human body is programmed, biologically programmed to survive. The natural inclination of human beings is to survive, and euthanasia inhibits this. Euthanasia is exactly the opposite. Euthanasia is terminating that. It's interfering with that inclination to survive, and so the claim is inherently euthanasia is wrong. Anything that interferes, this is natural law theory, right? Anything that interferes with nature is inherently wrong. So euthanasia is inherently wrong. But if that doesn't do it for you, he says, we've got some other options. One is the argument from self-interest. Miracles happen, people. Okay? He says miracles happen. Misdiagnoses and miracles happen. You could be one of those. He says cancer goes into spontaneous remission. People find out that they were diagnosed with a disease that they don't actually have. It was a misdiagnosis. These things do happen. And euthanasia shortens life and prevents a miracle from happening or a discovery of misdiagnosis. So, out of your own self-interest, he says, stay alive to open yourself up to one of these options. Now, the response to this, the objection to this argument is fairly clear. Those things don't happen that often. And if you are, a year into treatment for cancer and there hasn't been a discovery of misdiagnosis yet, saying, you know what, I don't want to spend the next 4 months of my life sick and in pain from cancer, from the chemo. I'd rather go ahead and have my life end as peacefully as possible. You know, that's the way it goes. And the misdiagnoses and the miracles, well, at least the misdiagnoses, when it comes to things like physician-assisted suicide, are why there are those checks and balances. You have to have a couple of doctors confirm the diagnosis. You have to have, you know, discussions and so forth. And finally, there's the argument from practical effects. Doctors and nurses are hurt, he says, when lives are lost. So euthanasia is painful to them. And he actually would probably lump active and passive into this. To withdraw treatment and, you know, have a patient die, or to administer medication and kill a patient, that hurts doctors and nurses. It's their job to save lives, to help people. So to, you know, commit any act of euthanasia, he says, is hurting them. It's interfering with their job. And the response here is very easily seen. You know, to watch a patient in a persistent vegetative state continue like that hurts doctors and nurses as well. Or to watch a patient suffer in pain and agony for longer than, you know, he or she has to, that hurts the doctors and the nurses as well. So, you know, some people say that the job of doctors and nurses is not just to save lives, but it's to help patients live as good a life as possible. And sometimes that means dying as peacefully as possible. Make sense?